Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith, and today we're talking about breath and life and how to use your breath throughout your life, including in your business life, how to change your experience. And we have with us here a literal record holder on breathwork, Erwan Le Corre. Welcome to Redbeard Radio.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone.
Now I'm going to start off with a story, as I always do. And this was a time where my breath did not work so well. I was sailing. I was going to sailing class. I was a teenager, and the ocean near where I live is 52 degrees year-round, which means once you get in it, especially if you're a spindly teenager with no body fat, you quickly freeze, you get hypothermia, you sink, and you die. I, being a very gangly and not muscular and not fat, about 14 years old at the time of this story, we were sailing out in the sailing class. This is summertime, so it's warm out of the water, but the water is still very cold. And we hit a little island on purpose, this island that's normally covered up. And some of the older kids said, oh, there's another island that's just over there. You can't see it, but we can walk there. And a few of the kids who were boring and lame, they stayed behind because they were lame. But me, being a cool kid, went with the rest of the pack of kids. And we walked to the other island through the salt water. This is a bit south of Seattle for folks who don't know where I am. And as we walked along, we stopped walking and started sort of hopping. And I was never a really great swimmer, but at this point I was very cold and not a great swimmer. And because I was a cool kid, I had not stayed back with the smart kids, by which I mean, you know, the lame kids that weren't very adventurous, nor was I wearing a life jacket because no one else was either. And at some point, I remember coming up out of the water. And what I was told later was that one of the kids who was in front, who was thankfully had some lifeguard experience, at one point looked back and noticed there was one fewer than there were before of all the kids in the sailing class. So he went back to where he last saw me. He went down in the ocean, grabbed me, pulled me back up, and then swam me back to shore. And it was somewhere in that being pulled up and being brought back to shore that I have a memory of. I don't remember sinking. I don't remember being under the water. I remember being pretty cold. And this is one of the foundational stories of my life where part of it is the wanting to be part of the club and doing something I couldn't actually do. That's a different episode of this podcast. But the breath and your ability to go interact with your world in your breath. And for all of the business owners that listen to this podcast, this idea of how do you use your breath to control your inner story, which matters whether you're selling something, it matters when you are writing something that's really important, it matters when you're on deadline, it matters when you're speaking on a stage, it matters when you're being creative. How do you breathe when you're being creative or not? How do you change your posture? I have a certain posture right now because I'm gonna have a video on me as we're also doing this thing live on Twitter, but I have a different posture if I'm, let's say, writing on a piece of paper, and that everything in there affects breath. And so today we're talking with Erwan here about breath and some of what he's come to understand in the process of attaining a very outlier experience in terms of your ability, Erwan, to manipulate your breath and to use that to go change how you experience the world. So that's the backstory. That's one of my stories around why I'm so interested in breath and breathing, because I've experienced it not having it available to me anymore. And I'm going to take a breath myself. We should probably all take a breath, right? Because we're on here with Erwan. And Erwan, for the folks who are on live stream, you're going to see Erwan here. Erwan, how ought we to breathe?
No rush, slowly through the nose and through the diaphragm. So through the diaphragm, because it's the essential muscle that creates ventilation. And ventilation, it's the biomechanical part of breathing, because there's also the other part of breathing that's less talked about, which is cellular respiration, what happens within the cells as they get or don't get oxygen and how they use it and all that gas exchange. So we breathe through the diaphragm. I mean, ideally, we optimally breathe through the diaphragm, through the nose, not through the mouth, and then slowly, which is called respiratory rate. It's how many breaths you take per minute. A breath is actually a breath cycle, which means one inhale, one exhale. So that one inhale, one exhale is one breath cycle. And we normally, when at rest, like right now we are at rest, we should not be taking more than, let's say, 5 to or 6 to 8, 10 at the most breath cycles like this per minute.
So why do we?
Why do we? There are a number of reasons. Number one is habit. It's just because we're used to breathe that way. But in most cases, it has to do with a number of variables that are combined together, including habit, which means that your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, the one part of your brain that keeps you breathing at all times, even when you do not pay attention, which is most of the time, we're not paying attention to our breath. And yet we are breathing, fortunately. We don't need an alarm or a reminder, or it doesn't need to be in a calendar. There's no electric shock if we stop breathing or something. It just happens. But the way it happens is not something that we should be thinking about or paying attention most of the time, because breathing it's a given. I mean, it's an excellent habit to pay attention to our breath, to remember our breath. But most of the time, we're busy. We're just living. We don't need to. The same way we don't need to pay attention to our digestion or other metabolic processes in our body. It's taken care of by parts of our brain in a way that's autonomic. It's subconscious. Now, because it's subconscious, that means that the way we breathe is set in a particular way and does not change. It only changes if we become active, if we're stressed. There are some variations, but most of the time we will breathe about the same way all the time because it's a program. So the strength of that habit is very important. And why is it that a certain breathing pattern is the way it is in a given individual? Well, we have to look back at what's happening in their life, but also what has been happening in their lives. And there can be so many variables that can be mimicry, for instance, which means that, for instance, your parents were overbreathers, people who were breathing too fast, as in 15, 20, sometimes 30 breath cycles per minute, which is very shallow and very fast. So if you grow up with parents or an entourage that breathes that way, you might just unconsciously, without even knowing, adopt that exact same breathing pattern because it's there. Then there are, most of the time, we're too stressed. So the nervous system is edgy.
Yeah.
And when it is, we breathe faster than we should. It's the fatigue that we may not acknowledge as such because we're so used to it, but our nervous system can be really fatigued, and then we breathe too fast. Other reasons are breathing through the mouth makes you breathe faster than breathing through the nose. Breathing through upper respiratory muscles, which also shortens, the length of each inhale and exhale, and therefore makes you take more breath cycles per minute. There's so many reasons. It can have to do with your metabolism. If you're not physically active, you will tend to breathe faster as well. So there's a lot of factors that are involved in that.
Another story for you. I used to do medieval sword fighting, sort of like mixed martial arts, but wearing 50 pounds of armor. And I heard a story about one exactly like that. One of our guys, Duke Gaston, and I heard about a video he took at one of the battles that we go to, and he had a little camera mounted inside his helmet. But the story wasn't what you saw, though he was a masterful sword fighter. The story was you could hear his breathing. Most of us, when we're running around in 50 pounds of armor, hitting people and being hit and literally running, most of us, but Duke Gaston, the story was, and maybe it was just nose breathing, I don't recall, but that this guy was so elite that he was completely relaxed, even while doing intricate sword work at very high speed, at a very high skill level over a long period of time. And we heard the story and we thought, whoa, Duke Gaston is serious, because he was above the rest of us.
He was very highly efficient, not only in his movement skills, but also in his the mental skill and breathing skill, all of that combined, because it's a whole eventually. You can be overall efficient if aspects of your behavior, of your performance, are inefficient, like breathing, especially breathing, because if your breathing is off, it's going to affect pretty much everything. So this is medieval martial art. It's a martial art. The art of sword fighting also exists in the eastern areas of the world, where one of the technical aspects that they look at, let's say when they do competitions, by the way, with weapons or not weapons, is not just the choreographies, the way the movements are executed. They pay attention to the way the artist breathes. And if they are jerky or too fast, too loud, that's going to decrease their rating, because it means that they are not fully in control.
This reminds me of another thing in sword fighting. When I was a more senior fighter, I did it for about a decade. I'd be training new guys, and I would be trying to train them in how to understand when they're watching a fight. And I'd say, okay, ignore everything except for how far apart the two fighters are, and then who is choosing that distance. And 9 times out of 10, if you understand who is choosing how far apart the fight is occurring, that person always wins. And there's all this distraction around there, but really it's who's choosing the distance. And what you're saying makes me wish I looked back, if I could rewind my memory and say, okay, let me look at who is choosing how fast they're breathing. And we have this technique. If you're
the mindset of self-growth. So even, let's say, if you are not doing that activity anymore, retrospectively, you wish you could get back and improve based on a new understanding, a new insight. That's interesting. By the way, the story you shared in your introduction of similar, not exactly the same, but similar events have happened to me. One of them was I was sailing. We stopped by a little island, and everybody decides to go walk on the island. So that's in Brittany. It's the same kind of weather. Even though it was in the summer, the water is very cold with strong currents in some places. And I say, no, I don't want to go. I want to stay on the boat. Really? Yeah, like, yes. And so they all go with a little, inflatable. And then I decide, because I'm mischievous, I decide that I would surprise them by going without them, them knowing that I would be there. And so I put everything in my stuff in plastic bags to double and like make it super tight to keep it all waterproof. And I start swimming. I could not believe how quickly I started to slow down, and I had to remain because I was completely alone, and it didn't seem, I don't know, was it 100 yards, 100 meters, I don't know, 150 maybe, not a very great distance. But when the water is cold and on top of that is moving, and you're moving, you're wasting energy, you're losing energy so fast. So it's not that you have a breathing issue, you have an hypothermic issue. At some point, you get so frozen that you can't move. That is when you sink. I did not sink that day, but I could see, I was like, Erwan, if you don't focus and swim faster without rushing, you will not make it. So I made it. And another time was, so you lose energy. Eventually you sink, and what's going to happen is that you have a reflex that is going to save your life. Your face, through the trigeminal nerve, is going to understand that your airways are immersed. The body cannot sense water actually for itself. What it can sense is a difference of pressure and a difference of temperature. So if the face feels that difference of pressure, difference of temperature, it doesn't matter if you're conscious or not. The autonomic nervous system, again, the one that's responsible for our survival, is going to understand, oh, okay, we can't breathe. So you're going to instinctively clench your jaws and close your airways and stop ventilation so that you don't drown. With the hope, it's a survival mechanism, with the hope that even though you are going to become unconscious, you're going to go limp, something will save you. Fortunately, a friend saved you. Once he brought you up to the surface, at what point did you regain consciousness?
I don't know. I've told this story so many times that I don't know what is a manufactured memory. I feel like I have a vision of the three kids that stayed with the boats on the island as we were swimming back. So I feel like I have a memory of before we got back to the island with the boats. But even that, I am dubious of what is real. My brother was there versus what my brother told me
Yeah.
versus what other people told me, because it was a long time ago. And so I'm not sure.
It is fine if you don't remember. Anyways, what is the most likely is that either the autonomic nervous system, the moment your face was above the surface, realized it's not nothing conscious. It's all about senses and intuition. Intuition. It's just senses. That your face was finally above the surface. Your airways were clear to breathe. Typically, what it takes is that can be just the breeze on your face, indicating, oh, okay, there's no more of that pressure, and now I feel that breeze. It's okay to breathe. Or they called you, they walk you up that way, maybe they slapped you. If they know the rescue protocols, they would blow on your eyelids right away, again, to activate the trigeminal nerve, which is typically way enough to revive you right away. But that's if you did not stay a long time underwater, which is very likely you did not stay a long time underwater. Therefore, you didn't go, you were in a great danger. But once you got outside of the surface, because you did not stay a long time underwater, you were not in any danger at all. The moment you breathe again, that's fine. There's no problem with that. The problem is if nobody's there. And that happened to me once, is that nobody was there. And so it's a miracle. It's a one in a, you can't even make a statistic about it, because there would be very few accounts of such an experience. So diving down, it's when I didn't know better. I didn't know what's, safety protocols, and I didn't know anything like that. I made all the mistakes that somebody who dives to a depth should do. I did some, heavy breathing, but that was like 10 years ago or something. Some heavy breathing a bit. Then I didn't have any safety. The water was cold. I stopped on the way down, and then I decided, no, I must. So my mind saying, no, I will do it no matter what. So then I resumed my descent. And then when I finally touched the ground, I was happy, because that was 24 meters.
Wow.
So that's 80 something feet. But then I'm like, okay, now I need to go back up. And then you start to panic a bit, and then you tell yourself, don't panic. But at the same time, you are very concerned. What I remember, so I'll write this in my book. So I'm going to write a book about, breathing, breathful work, all that. What I remember is being suspended in the water. And then I open my eyes, and my consciousness reawakes. And I'm like, it's not who I am, but what am I doing? What is this? And I look up, and I can see the sun. I can see the surface. It's 3 feet up above me. And then right away, I just swim to the surface to breathe. So if you don't understand physiology, you can't explain this, or you will explain it wrong. For instance, you will say, well, I tried to reach the surface, I lost consciousness, and then miraculously I regained consciousness, and then I reached the surface. That is impossible. If you lose consciousness, you lose consciousness. You're not going to regain it. That has never been seen before. So the only explanation is that I reached the surface right on time. I probably took a breath, maybe 2 or 3. Same as you, in those circumstances, memory tends to shut off. You don't remember consciously. Of course, since to remember anything, you need to be conscious. If you're not conscious, you don't remember. So if you're unconscious, you don't remember what happened. And you don't even remember what happened just before you lost consciousness, because you lacked oxygen to properly process that memory and to store it, to keep it. Anyway, so I breathed, I lost consciousness, I fell in the water, and miraculously, that oxygen that I just had inhaled hit my brain, hit my prefrontal cortex, reignited my consciousness, I woke up while underwater and I saved my life. That way, otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. That would have been, more than 10 years ago. And there would not be breathful work or anything. Not even the book, the natural movement book, nothing. Just I would have been, okay, if the guy, the MovNat guy, well, he died. Sometimes the lessons are hard earned. I can't say that this one was hard earned. Sometimes you are doing something stupid, not because you know better, you just don't know better. And I didn't know better. A lot of people have killed themselves doing this kind of things, sometimes just swimming underwater. So it's called a shallow blackout. It's right under the surface. And you push and you push and you push. And especially if you did hyperventilation a la Wim Hof exercise, you hyperventilate, then you delay the warnings that tell you you need to breathe, and then you push. Then by the time it's too late, so you lose consciousness. If nobody's around, you're done. End of the story. And another time, and that was during a breath hold maximum attempt, and I had security, I had safety. I lost consciousness without losing consciousness. So typically, when you lose consciousness, you get limp. In that case, after 5 minutes of breath holding, which I had done multiple times, so it wasn't the length at this point was not even a problem. It happened. I can't remember nothing. But what is true, because it was filmed, is that I was doing my static apnea as if I was conscious. Means I was obviously intentionally holding my breath and then going through the last effort of, when it gets really, really, really hard and you have to make a conscious decision of time to breathe now. Well, all that part I can't remember after 5 minutes. So it went all the way almost to 7 minutes. At the 6:44, 48, I don't remember exactly. That's when I breathe again. And that's when my memory comes back. Anything that happened in between, so 5 minutes and 6, so it's almost 2 minutes, not of unconsciousness. I did not black out, because blackout would mean you become unconscious and you need to be revived, or I blacked out myself. I don't know exactly what happened. I like to say I blanked out. Blank.
This brings us back to sword fighting for me, where it was frequent, where after one of our tournaments where it was one-on-one, it was always obvious who won because someone gave up, another person got a declared victory. But it was also frequent, if I was the one fighting, I would go back to, after I'm done with the fight, go talk to my friends, and I would say, what happened? And they would have to tell me what happened, because often, maybe half the time, I don't know, a lot of time, I would not be able to tell you, even to the point of I was once in a fight where I was facing off with a guy and he just gave up. And I said, what? And he said, good hit. And I said, I didn't hit you. And he said, you just hit me in the head. And I got into a place where my body just did its thing without checking into my brain in some way. And my brain chose to not register my arm flying through the air. I didn't hear the sound, heard nothing, which just blew my mind that I could be unaware while moving. And I just got to taste this thing a few times.
What you describe sounds exactly like people who've encountered like a real fight, like for instance, a gunfight. They barely remember anything because they have tunnel vision. All your senses are altered because you fight for your life. So the way your consciousness needs to operate, where the energy needs to be allocated, is different than when you can take the time to think and reflect and make decisions like that. So it looks like you would delve into that state of mind, which is a different cognitive mode, where like tunnel vision, everything disappears. You're just in the moment, and then you have no memory. You can't recall exactly the details.
That was one of the hard things to train our new fighters in, is that you have to be so good that you can move faster than you can possibly think. And our main teacher, who was good enough to become a world champion, known as the American all around the world, he would train us on our defense constantly, and just all these shield drills endlessly. And he said, you have to get so good that your defense does its own thing. without you even thinking about it. So all your brain can be focused on your offense, which it sounds cool when you hear it. And then you go through months and years of shield drills and you start to hate this. But if you do all your shield drills, eventually you don't get any stronger, but everyone else starts giving up faster. And I got really like, why are people giving up so fast? Why are they getting tired so fast? Because I didn't feel stronger, but they just would start to slip, let their guard down. Fascinating.
It is. It really is.
Well, so let's talk about, for people who are listening to this and they're saying, wow, this is all fun to talk about these altered states of consciousness. For the average person who's both not swimming through an ocean while sailing and also not in a fight for their lives, how can a person bring in more awareness of their breathing, more mindfulness in their breathing into their regular lives?
Yes, that's a good question.
Well, my first question is about really the sleep thing. I track my sleep sometimes, and I know that I get roughly 14 to 14 and a half respirations per minute. At least that's what the tech tracks. And you're saying, man, 15 or up, you're just breathing way too much, more like 6 times a minute. And I'm thinking, oh no, I'm over twice what Erwan's saying is a good thing, but I'm asleep. I can't even consciously slow down my breathing.
Yeah.
So what should I do?
Well, so first off, it's just like anything else really that you want to do or that you say you need to do, or I have to do this. Probably it would be a good thing for me to do some breath work or to be aware of my breathing more. Yeah, and probably you say the same about exercise, about the way you feed yourself, about the way you live your life in so many aspects. That would be nice if, that would be better if I should do this. But then you don't. So the question is like, well, but how then, I know it's beneficial to me, but I'm not doing it. I'm not paying attention to it, or then I do, but then it's short-lived, and then I make a decision, a commitment, and then it's short-lived too. It's a huge question for most people, because then they're going to tell themselves, I don't have a time. There's going to be all kinds of reasons why they are not going to do it. To me, it always boils down to a very simple question, which is, how much do you value what you say you want? That's it. If you do not value anything, you are not giving that thing any attention. Presence to your loved ones, presence to yourself. Is that something that is even something you are paying attention to, how much presence you give to your loved ones or to yourself? And if you talk about just about the presence you give to yourself, the attention you give to yourself, what is that presence about? What is that attention about? Is it about just what the body looks like? Well, if you value that and you're like, I want a better looking body, you're going to put the effort in doing that. You see, when you value something, it does become more a need than a want, because everybody's got wants. And if you're going to say, well, do you value your health? Well, of course I do. Well, yeah, but you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. There's no change, no self-confidence, or self-discipline to be found anywhere. So you may mentally say, I value my health, or I value this, or I want this, and I have a desire for that. But in truth, if it's not backed up, it means you don't really value that you say you value. When you do, then you find a way. You start somewhere. And even when you really value anything, you become relentless about it. You become obsessed about it. And finding motivation is easy because you just want it so bad.
I've been listening to Jocko and Akira the Dawn on my way to the gym each morning. And there's a lot of great stuff there where Jocko's saying motivation is a really bad way to make decisions. And 2 years ago, I did 75 hard, which for folks who are not familiar, among other things, is 2 workouts a day. And there was times where we'd be going to bed, except my wife would go to bed and I'd go back down to my rowing machine to go do my second 45-minute workout. And my wife pointed out, like, okay, it's great you're doing this, but why didn't you do it earlier in the day? If you actually value this, sure, you're doing it because you said you're going to do this thing, which I completed it. But if that's the only reason you're doing 2 workouts a day, because it's this temporary thing, that's not an identity change. The real problem here is what you're choosing to do instead. Not very self-impressive to look on.
Yeah. Cognition is complex. Why it is that we do what we do, what it is that we pursue what we pursue. You may not even care whatever workout you're doing. It could be anything, a run, a swim, a kettlebells, whatever. It could be that you want to prove yourself the point that you can be dedicated. And so what you pursue is not, in fact, the physiological aspect. It's not that outcome that you're pursuing. It's a form of self-validation. You need to validate yourself, prove yourself that, hey, I was able to commit. I had the self-discipline, not just once, not just twice, but say over a month or something. And once you've proven that to yourself, you're like, okay, that's enough. And all of a sudden you're disinterested in whatever specific activity, because it was never about the activity. It was about the achievement or the accomplishment. And it was not even about the achievement and the accomplishment of the physical side of things. It was just about the self-validation. It's like, now I feel good about myself because now I know that I have the ability to commit, to be disciplined, even when I have no desire whatsoever to do it on some days, on certain days. Okay. So why would you want to practice breathing? How do you remember? Okay. So number one, I personally do not do any breath work. I don't care about breath work. Shocking, huh? Like, what do you mean you don't do breath work? No, I do no breath work. I do breath hold work. I hold my breath. So I'm not working on that breath. I'm working on not breathing, which is very different. It's a completely different animal. But you're like, most people, because breath work is all the rage. Well, what do you mean? Like, you teach breath work, and how can you say you don't care about breath work? Well, I don't care about breath work because I've done the work. It is not by doing breathing exercises that I'm going to improve much, if at all, at this point, my breathing. Why is that? Well, because my reflexive breathing, which is the breathing I do when I'm not paying attention, is fine to me. I always breathe through the nose. And when I don't, when I am a little challenged because of some inflammation or anything like that, I sense it right away. Even at night, I'm able to become, half awake when I'm challenged breathing through my nose, and to focus on breathing through my nose anyways until my airways open up, so that I don't breathe even temporarily through my mouth. That's how much I value, both consciously and somehow unconsciously, the quality of my breath. So why would I do breathing exercises? Breathing exercises is for beginners, period. There's a point where once you've done enough breathing exercises, you don't need to do more breathing exercises. Because what matters is how it's going to help you improve your reflective breathing. So if I give you certain breathing exercises to do, and you do them really well, and that's 5 minutes a day or 10 minutes a day, every day. But the rest of the time, which is most of the time, that's 99% of the time, if you take 5 minutes out of 24 hours, what's the percentage of that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If the rest of the time your breathing is completely off, then what's the point?
Vanity.
Or not necessarily vanity, just you're not either you're not given the right exercises for you, or you just do some breath work. So you put some work into your breath, thinking, hey, if I put some work into my breath, then it's going to improve everything. But do you even know what it is exactly that you are trying to improve? And then do you assess how improved that gets or not? So my lung volume it's just much more than anyone, my gender, my age. Okay. The strength of the power of my respiratory muscles, very strong. My ability to apply that breathing power into my workouts or my exercises, no problem at all. Again, my day-to-day regular breathing, just consistently slow, nasal, diaphragmatic. So why would I need to do more breathing exercises? Or then you're like, yeah, well, but it can help you slow down and down regulate your nervous system. Yeah, maybe. But what if I don't need to downregulate my nervous system because I don't get completely edgy and, because I don't need it. So, well, then you would have to throw into there, well, what about energetic channels? Well, I don't know anything about energetic channels. It's not, you are going to do much more for your energetic channels by just going on a walk outside in the sun
Hmm.
and, barefoot on the ground, that by doing this and that in a city or in an indoors environment for a few minutes and think, oh, wow, I just realigned my energetic channels. How do you even know? Well, I feel better. Well, maybe you just feel better simply because you gave yourself a few minutes of presence to self,
Hmm.
of attention to one thing and not 10,000 things, which is that one thing would be just breathing. You slow down your breathing, which has an impact on your heart rate, on what mode your nervous system shifts to. So it's going to shift to relaxation instead of agitation. Because you breathe slower, you're going to increase levels of CO2. You're going to retain more CO2 in your body, which is going to benefit your cellular respiration. Your oxygen uptake, not the intake, will go up, means that you are breathing less, so you're breathing less oxygen, but the oxygen that you're breathing is better delivered now to your cells. So that's cellular respiration. Well, all of a sudden, of course, your energy feels great. There it goes. Your energy channels are right there. There's nothing mysterious about it. So, are breathwork exercises beneficial to people? Absolutely, and to most people they are. Why? Because most people have deficiencies in the way they breathe. They have poor lung volume, like their lung volume is small, their rib cage is stiff, their respiratory muscles are weak, their airways are clogged, their blood vessels are stiff and narrow, etc., etc. So how would you bring oxygen to your tissues with such a suboptimal, as to not hurt feelings, suboptimal physiological aspects? Okay, if that is your case, and that's the case of a lot of people, for sure, like even some hyperventilation is going to be great. You know why? Because all of a sudden it feels like you're exercising. All of a sudden you're making your respiratory muscles work stronger, like a workout. And all of a sudden your lungs are inflating more than they normally would, which normally would never happens to you. Well, then you're like, well, it works. Yeah, but maybe you would go on a run and you would have more benefits for the same amount of work, same amount of time. Why? Because you would be running on your feet. There would be a greater impact, for instance, on your bone marrow, and so on what's called erythropoiesis, which is produced by the bone marrow. So which happens not when you sit doing hyperventilation, but when you are lifting heavy or running or jumping and landing and doing all these real movements. That's when erythropoiesis is going to go up. What's erythropoiesis? Well, it's the production of red blood cells. So you're going to create more red blood cells in greater quantity, so greater blood quantity and greater blood quality as well. Well, then when you have that, cellular respiration, how well oxygen is delivered to your tissues, goes up. And that hyperventilation is completely natural. And now your heart is working for real. Your respiratory muscles are working for a reason. Your lungs are working for a reason. Your blood vessels are working for a reason. And even your autonomic nervous system understands, even though it does not consciously reason, but that hyperventilation that you are going to trigger naturally when you actually exercise is contextual. So it makes sense to your autonomic nervous system. I'm running, I need greater gas exchange, therefore I breathe harder. But when you consciously trigger that with your conscious mind, the prefrontal cortex, and then your autonomic nervous system is trying to make sense of that, it makes no sense at all. So it's like, I'm probably hyperventilating because there's a big stress there, there's a danger, there's a threat, right? So this is my view on all of that. Most of the breath work people should do, in my opinion, should happen through movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, if they are not familiar with their own respiratory system, then the isolation of specific exercises, how to slow down your breath, how to control your abdominal muscles, especially your diaphragm, but not only. How to inhale maximally, how to breathe through the nose, but how to control the soft palate of the glottis to restrict airflow, etc., etc. You can do those exercises to, one, learn aspects of your own functioning that you were not aware of, two, learn to control them, and then three, the next step is going to be, okay, I've learned this in isolation, I have control of that breathing in isolation. Now I'm going to bring that breath control into a real context, which is movement, which is what we're supposed to do normally every day, several times a day, to be moving in diverse ways. It's called natural movement. All right, so once you have that, you just need to maintain that. Once it's established and your baseline respiratory rate is somewhere around 6 to 10, depending on some variables, but pretty much it's definitely not above 10. Why would you do breathwork exercises? So you can do that when you are stressed. And what should you do when you feel stressed? Not all hyperventilation. Simply slow breathing, slow down your breathing through the nose and through the diaphragm, and focusing on what's called interoception, how it feels inside. And it's going to quiet, it's going to down regulate your nervous system, which is going to make your mind also slow down. So you slow down your breath, you slow down your mind, your thinking, you slow down everything. Now you could call that breath work. It's just, in fact, it's a form of exercise or moment in down regulating oneself, quieting oneself, giving oneself the gift of presence, of attention to self that we all deserve. And that's it. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
You're reminding me of a time in Vipassana where they started us off paying attention to how our breath felt on the outside of our nose. And then as the days go on and you're sitting there breathing in silence for hours and hours and hours, like you do in Vipassana, you start to chase your breath and you start to feel the inside of your nostril and then the top of your trachea, and then just really chasing your breath down into your body. And I did that enough that I have a pretty good understanding that when I'm at peace, it's roughly right here is where I can stop feeling my breath, depending on how cold it is outside. But if I want to go get really quiet, I just start to say, okay, I'm going to feel my breath at the top of my trachea and just get really quiet and then feel the movement, feel the chill of the air.
Yes, the reason why you would want to pay attention to your breathing, it could be for the sake of meditation, for the sake of altering your state of mind, which is the mind altering itself through its own intention and through also control over what's normally autonomic. So you consciously override the part of your autonomic nervous system that is normally taking care of your breathing for you, and you override that consciously. When you do that, you become like super self-conscious, and the good way of being self-conscious. You become really one with yourself. When you become one with yourself, you become one with a lot more than yourself. And for people who never have done that, it can be absolutely mind-altering to begin with, because of the changes it's going to cause, beneficial changes to your physiology, to the oxygenation of your brain. It's called regional oxygenation. Your brain is going to be really well oxygenated, so therefore it's going to impact your cognition. It's going to maybe open up some areas of your brain that normally are dormant. And then when you are not edgy anymore, when you're really calm, really focused, you can listen more, pay attention more to areas of your own consciousness that normally are completely neglected because you're too busy paying attention to something outside of you and pursuing things, which is legit, by the way. We all are busy at some point, and typically most of the time in our life. But when you give yourself that presence and that time, but it takes time. That's not going to happen in 5 minutes. That's not going to happen in 10 or 20 minutes, maybe. But it's going to take a lot longer. Normally, it would have to be, like much longer than just a short breath work session. And so typically that's why people like to do hyperventilation, Because when you do hyperventilation, you're actually going to decrease the amount of oxygen that your brain can use. And that's going to give you a high. So there's two ways. One is that it's actually going to create a sense of threat, and it's going to make you emotional because it's shifting your autonomic nervous system into arousal, the sympathetic nervous system. It's a mode. It's the same nervous system, okay? It's not two nervous systems. It's the same nervous system, just it changes its mode. It changes the way it operates, changes its vibration. Typically, it finds a balance. Ideally, it finds a balance between the two. But when you are going to hyperventilate, it sends the message to your nervous system, there's a stress, there's a threat. So if you're already stressed out, if you have trauma, if you have, you're an emotional person for whatever reason, it's very likely that you're going to start shaking and probably cry and all kind of things. Once you do that, obviously you stop hyperventilating. So now you're going to call that emotional detox. So you just stress yourself out. It brings what's within you, which is probably a lot of emotions that are, relegated to, buried under layers and layers of conscious concerns, but you don't want to address your emotional self too much because it hurts, it's unpleasant. And then all of a sudden, by just tweaking your breathing pattern that way, in a way that's like kind of brutal, it's like really hard, then all of a sudden that emotionality that you normally contain is find a way out. Once it finds the way out, you cry. It always feels good to cry, especially when you're the type that does not let yourself cry. And then you also get back to a slower breathing, which then you find peace. Okay? So that can be good. That can feel good, but it's not going to solve the cause of the problem. You're not solving your trauma because you just did that, or because you're going to do that every day. You're not solving the problems that caused you to, and your nervous system, because eventually it's not just something in the mind that's like etherical. It's also just really anchored in the body, especially in the nervous system itself. So modify the breathing, you alter, regardless of the way, you will alter your nervous system. You will alter the way you think, the way you feel, the way, and all that. And regarding hyperventilation, then the second thing that's going to happen in other people is that they experience some kind of a high. They're like, wow, there must be some natural DMT that I'm producing in my mind. Absolutely not. I can tell you, if I've done tons of psychedelics, so I know exactly what it is. I know exactly how to navigate this world. Full disclosure, I'm not talking about like 3 ayahuasca ceremonies. I'm talking about hundreds of them, or mushrooms or things like that. Okay, very intentional. So I know what a trip is, and that high that you will experience with hyperventilation has nothing to do with that. It's much simpler. Every time you exhale, and you exhale a lot when you hyperventilate. So you are going to inhale much more oxygen than you can possibly use. And just because you breathe in more oxygen does not mean that you super oxygenate. That's a myth. That's completely absurd. Just because you breathe more oxygen does not mean that you can use more oxygen, because that also means that you don't need more oxygen. Your metabolism doesn't change, except for the little calorie consumption caused by the extra respiratory effort. So you're breathing all that oxygen that you basically exhale every time. So with every exhale, when you hyperventilate again, you're breathing really hard, typically through the open mouth, big volume, fast rate. Okay. With those exhales, there's a ton of oxygen in those exhales. There's also tons of CO2. And that CO2 is very important because we have tons of carbon, as a gas, on average 120 liters in every one of us. It's a huge amount. Why? Because they determine the pH of our tissues. And each of our tissue have their own pH. The brain has a certain pH, the liver has a different pH, the skin, the blood has a different pH. That pH is determined and maintained by a certain level of CO2. Now, if you flush that CO2 out, you're like, well, that's a byproduct of using oxygen. It's not a big deal. Actually, it's a big deal, because when you change the pH of your body, you will not oxygenate as well. Okay, so acidity goes down, pH goes up, and then even in the presence of oxygen, you have all this oxygen that knocks at the door and wants to be used. Knock, knock, it's oxygen. For that oxygen to be delivered to your cell, each cell needs to have an environment, a pH that's normal. Otherwise, that oxygen will not slide off, will not be. So that's the difference between oxygen intake and oxygen uptake. That uptake goes down. So you're still conscious. Remember, every tissue, every organ has its own pH, the brain too. So over time, the pH of the brain changes as well. And now the pH of the brain cannot oxygenate. When the brain does not receive enough oxygen or cannot use enough oxygen, see the difference? So first off, hyperventilation will also constrict your airways, and the cerebral blood flow, the blood flow that brings oxygen to your brain, will start to be lower. So you receive less oxygen, but on top of that, the oxygen that you receive, you cannot really use because the pH is not right.
I've never heard it described that way before.
So now you're having a high because the brain is very sensitive, that's for sure. Specific, let's say specific about where it sends oxygen. It's not flooding, the whole brain is not constantly flooded with blood or with oxygen at all times. It depends on the activity. Just the same way, if you exercise, everybody knows if you do your biceps, you'll get a congestion in your biceps, not in your calves, right? Mm-hmm. That's where the oxygen is going to go because that's where it's needed for the effort. Well, the brain is the same. So now your prefrontal cortex, that is the one that keeps you conscious and alert and everything, is the one that's going to receive less oxygen. Why? Because for the brain, the survival reflex is to bring oxygen to other areas of the brain that are less important than consciousness. More important than consciousness for survival. So now you're going into the limbic brain, and then that's the dream world. You're less conscious, more dreamy, and now you're having a high. And you're having a high just by doing like those 5 minutes of hyperventilation. You don't need to take a pill. You don't need to take whatever crazy thing or to drink a shot or something. That's great. So for people who are constantly overthinking, and God knows there's a lot of us, like blah, 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 blah in the mind, like blah, 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 like different multitasking in the brain to begin with. Okay? And because it's a habit. Well, all of a sudden, you're not doing that. Wow. That's a relief. So I understand that some people are like, this does amazing for me, saves my life. Well, yeah, because it's a quick fix.
I feel like I could listen to you for hours. For other folks who feel that way, what can they find at breathholdwork.com to go learn more about these different ways of looking at breath and how it can impact their lives?
Yes, I have a website called Breath Hold Work. I have an e-course that is made of 4 modules. In that e-course, you will learn much more than what I just explained in this conversation. Much more. A lot of exercises, including breath work exercises, which is breathing exercises, but also breath holding exercises, no hyperventilation, and most importantly, exercises for your mind, exercising to learn how to operate your mind differently. So that meditation is not just, okay, I'm trying to not think, which is extremely hard. And for most people, counterproductive, it doesn't work. Meditation is not also just observe your thoughts, but in a way that's not judgmental and detached. That is a form of meditation. That's not the only one. And ultimately, the point is, can you consciously impact the way your mind expresses itself? And when I say can you, I'm talking about your mind. Your mind not only observing itself, but your mind defining in real time how it wants to experience itself. Images or no thought or nothing or something, and what is that thing? It's all internal, it's all in the mind, and that's where it starts. Because then ultimately that mind has to not just know itself, and to know itself, it has to also look at itself and then explore itself, try things and change things, and basically practice itself. And once it knows itself better, then it can better go into the world and interact with everything external. But if it does not know itself and it tries to be successful dealing externally with the world, it may have some success, but it will also, have some limitations.
Erwan, this has been an amazing hour of my life. I hope all the listeners have had that same experience. For folks listening on the podcast, Erwan's on Twitter, ErwanLeCorre. His website is breathholdwork.com. I'm at Redbeard Brian on Twitter. Erwan, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much. I enjoyed our conversation.